It was great. So last week I used a lot of driving metaphors for talking about, I mean, it felt pretty good, like the point came across. But Romans chapter 12, he makes an argument. And in the argument, he carries this idea of living sacrifice. And he moves through the idea of living sacrifice to what genuine love is and how we test that and our purity. Because all this has to do with how we live righteously with the people around us, right? If there's one overarching theme of the entire book of Romans, it is good. You guys are a good class. I don't deserve a class this good. I usually get things thrown at me, but I'm finding my place here still. So he moves from this idea of a living sacrifice, and then he moves from living sacrifice to grace. And if you guys remember, grace is the ability to see potential in the things or people. Well, let me not say things, because Paul is speaking to people. He's speaking to us, and he's speaking to the church in Rome. More specifically, he's speaking to the church in Rome. There's a lot that we can learn from what Paul has to say to these people in Rome, because there's a lot of things about the church in Rome and what our modern church line up in. I mean, we live in somewhat similar societies, don't we? In Rome, they live in a hedonistic society. If it feels good, do it. Now, anybody ever turn on their TV before? What are they always telling you on the TV? If it feels good, do it. Right? That's called hedonism. That's an underlying practice of hedonism. Okay? So people will say, oh, they're hedonists, right? Well, that's what that means, is that they do whatever feels best for them. Now, every animal walking on the planet, guess what they are? Hedonist. Because an animal, my wife works with horses, and I've recently worked with goats and teenagers, and one thing all three of those have in common is that everything for them is about maximum pleasure, minimum pain, right? How their body responds to something is exactly how they are going to respond. They can be steered very easy, like James talks about the bit and bridle, right? So Paul talks about that, and here's the gifts of grace, with our sober judgment. And then he talks about the mark of a true Christian. And he says, let our love be genuine, without hypocrisy. And that should bring us all to that question where we ask ourselves and we say, am I faking this? Because we think that a lot of times that because we're told to do something and because we do it, we've honored it. But in reality, we haven't, because sometimes we're just faking it. Sometimes we pretend that we love other people, don't we? Come on, if we're all honest, we do it. But the reality is that Paul's going to start peeling back those layers. He's going to start saying, he's opened this with living sacrifice. Okay, if we present ourselves to God, holy and acceptable, right? He's said that, and he's moved to the idea of what our love should be. And then he uses this interesting phrase that still it rings in my head over and over again. I don't know if it rings in anyone else's head, but I hear it all the time. In verse 10 of chapter 12, he says, let love one another with brotherly affection, outdoing one another in showing honor. And for us, for a long period of my life, before I actually dug into Romans and started studying it in the Greek, that was just something that I flew over. It's like, hey, we're supposed to love one another. And I forget the whole part where he says, without hypocrisy, abhor what's evil, love what's good. I fly over that. But Paul is doing a strange thing with words because he's saying agape philemo. He's saying with brotherly love underneath what he's saying, okay? I don't know if I can translate this in the Greek the right way. But underneath what he's saying is the same thing that Peter and Jesus, the conversation they had. When Jesus says to Peter, he says, hey, Peter, do you love me? Do you agape me, Peter? And Peter's like, I like you. Okay, and I had this conversation last week, and I have it every week with myself. And Peter says, I like you. He's being genuinely honest, right? Because Peter knows he can't love Jesus like Jesus loves him. And we all know that. If we think we can love Jesus to the extent that he loves us, then we are clearly need some guidance to how much Jesus truly loves us. Okay? And so he says, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yeah, I like you, Jesus. And Jesus responds to him with, feed my sheep. And then they're sitting there having dinner, the rabble, how that is at dinner time. Everybody's roaring, talking about stuff and ideas. Then Jesus stops him all of a sudden. He says, Peter, do you love me again? And Peter's like, I like you, Jesus. I like you. And he's like, well, take care of my lambs. And then Peter, the party starts up again. And Peter stops him, or Jesus stops him again, and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter is like, Jesus, you know that I like you. You know how much. You know all things. You know this. Basically, why are you doing this to me? Why are you putting me on the spot? And then Jesus responds with, feed my lambs. And then Jesus says, you will love me, Peter. You will. Because what Peter didn't understand in that moment, as he moved through his pastoral ministry, this is the beauty of that. Jesus knew already, right? Jesus knows, Peter doesn't. He sticks to the words that Jesus said to him. He said, you'll know how to love me. In other words, right, in Adam's words, you'll know how to love me by taking care of the people that I love. That's how you'll learn to love like God. That's what he says to him. And when Paul says this right here, love one another with brotherly affection, what he's saying, or what I hear about that, my interpretation, is what he's saying is that you're not capable of loving like God does. But if you can love people like your brother, you can learn how to love like God does. Because how does God love? Perfectly. And how did he do that? Well, there's no greater love than this, is there? So as you move toward that, that's, the word sanctification pops into my head. Because if we fake loving, then all we end up doing is liking. But if we move toward how he loved us, and we fixate on the words that he said, then we move toward him. Amen? And that's what I hear from Romans chapter 12. That's the mark of a true Christian, is that we move toward love, where other people fake it. Because we know what true love actually will cost us, don't we? It's everything that we are. And other people, well, they're still fixated on how much pleasure or how much pain that they can derive. Or how much pleasure they can enjoy and how much pain that they can avoid. And for us, we know that love ultimately leads us not this direction, but to this one, so that we can find ultimate joy. That's greater than happiness. So he moves on to these ideas. Bless those who persecute you, right? That's pretty easy. And I was talking about driving in your car. Anybody do that experiment where you realize that you're in your own little universe? And it's like all of a sudden, wow, you like realize that fact that I am not so good at running my own little universe, even though there's only like 4 seats, unless you drive a minivan. Even though there's only like 4 seats, and most of the time those seats aren't occupied. It's like, wow, I am a terrible ruler of my own little 23 square foot universe right here, right? As I project this 4,000-pound weapon down the road at 70 miles an hour. Okay? So, I mean, it's eye-opening for me. I don't know if anyone else has tried that. If you haven't, it's good to just observe yourself and how you act in your car, because that's the only universe that you think you have control over, and the way that you act inside of that universe. So with that said, congratulations, we've finished chapter 12. So I had some little badges. I'd give everybody badges, but I know where they're actually kept, okay? I know where they're kept. So with that said, we're moving on to the easiest chapter to teach in Romans, especially to Americans, all right? What do you guys think that's about? Well, we'll dig in, all right? Without further ado, and I don't know if it's me being late, but it's 20 minutes after, so I'm going to read the entire chapter to you guys, and if that's all you get, from me standing up here and talking about driving cars and silly things, then please listen to what Paul has to say. Because he's gone from what truly marks us as Christians, as followers of Jesus, to something that, I myself argued with Paul yesterday about this idea. And you'll hear the argument. I have a hunch you'll hear the arguments going on in your head as I read through what Paul has to say. But try to diminish that, as that little fire starts to roar up and you think about all the things that you shouldn't listen to, and listen to Paul. Because he genuinely cares for us. And Jesus genuinely cares even more so. And he's brought us all here, so let's pay honor where honor is due. So without further ado, it sounds like I'm a poet up here. Without further ado, Romans chapter 13. And you'll have to forgive my voice. I wish it was better today, but all right, I'm going to do my best. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resist what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjugation, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to him to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. The day is at hand. So let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desire. All right. So how many of you had the argument going on with authorities in your head when you hear Paul talking about all these authorities come from God? Come on. If you're honest with yourself, you do hear that. Because we're Americans, aren't we? I think most of us in here are Americans. Anyone from Sudan? Okay. We're Americans. Our culture has taught us to what? If there's one thing that culture has taught us in our modern American society, it's not to trust authority, is it? For every generation that's come up, what's the first thing that they do? They rebel against authority. I have a feeling that this isn't a new concept, right? That this has happened for a long time, like all the way from the Garden of Eden, maybe. Well, okay. This chapter right here is one that I know Pastor Ray taught out of it last week. an excerpt from it. And he did a good job teaching. He was aiming at something, right? So in full context, you can hear almost from chapter 12, the second part of chapter 12, where Paul says, let love be genuine. This chapter almost mirrors that one, if you notice, because he talks about submission to authorities, and then he moves to what? Owe nothing to anyone. He talks about taxes, right? Like everybody. In Paul's day, it was the same as it is in our day. When April 15th shows up, how many people are like, yes, right? Yes, the government's going to take 25% of my income. Ooh, 30. I just had a good year. It's great. I get to give more money to the government. All right? How many people are like, put a smile on your face and go, joy. We're honest with ourselves. None of us. 0%. I mean, I'm sure there's that one exception to the rule out there. There's one person out there just writing the check and being like, this is great, I get to feed people who don't deserve it. Yeah, so anyway, what Paul is doing, okay, and one thing that we can get wrong with what Paul's trying to say is that he's trying to make me into someone else, right? Like, well, wait a second. There's got to be exceptions to this rule, right? There's got to be exceptions because this guy's a bad guy. This guy was a bad guy in the Bible. This guy was a bad guy in the Bible. This guy was a bad guy in the Bible. So let's go ahead and put on our backpacks and let's go through some of the bad guys of the Bible. Okay, because I know everybody's thinking there's one bad guy and he's trying to do all these things with bathrooms and the military and stuff like that. And you're like, that guy, he can't be a good guy. He can't be an authority for God, right? So we'll walk through, and I'll go to one of my favorite examples is Pharaoh in Egypt. Pharaoh was the big bad guy of his day. Anybody remember Pharaoh, right? Threw all the babies in the river. He did all that terrible stuff, threw all the babies in the river, hunted Moses, He's super bad guy, right? He made himself God, right? He was the authority. Who put him in his seat? Well, Paul's already talked about that a little bit. He said something about clay, right? How does the potter say to the clay? Okay, so now, the real question is, if God's people hadn't been subjugated to the point of almost desperation, how much power would Pharaoh have over them in the first place? 0 power. Right? If they were still the wandering tribe of Abraham that had if you look at the stories, before they were subjugated for 400 years in Egypt, they were unstoppable, completely unstoppable. If God hadn't brought them to Egypt and then put this evil tyrant over them, right? How would they have ever been delivered? How would we ever know what it's like to be delivered? Because God cares about something underneath all of that. Because we look at authorities a lot of times and we say, oh, this guy is clearly working for the bad guy, right? But if you look carefully in the book of Job, who's the bad guy work for? Okay, before we step on the moral slippery slope here, everything that we know gains its authority from God. There might be things that talk about how they're in rebellion against God, but when God says, they do. There's one exception. Humans. Because what did we do? We seized autonomy, okay? For as much as we want to blame the devil for all the evil things that happen in the world, guess who's ultimately responsible for all the evil in the world? Who brought it in? Does the Bible say the devil brought evil into the world? It was us that did it. See, because the root of every mistake that we've ever made in our life is trying to blame something else, right? It was the president's fault. I didn't open rebellion because, well, he's the bad guy in the story. Okay? And we talked about last week, if you're a true Christian, who's the bad guy? Yeah, I wake up and look at him every day in the mirror as I'm running late and I'm trying to get the water out of my hair. That's the bad guy. That's the one that I'm facing. That's the guy who's got to change. Now, Paul, underneath that, he's not, now, don't get me wrong, Paul's not saying that directly to us, but he's trying to get us to understand something because he knows that this is a soft spot for everybody. Now, think about this, okay? He's just mentioned this to the Roman church. The Roman church has been hunted down individually. These people have been crucified, set on spikes, fed to lions. They've watched their brothers and sisters die every day. And what Paul's not saying is pick up a sword. He's not once said that. Because in the last chapter, he said something about who's the one? Vengeance. Who owns vengeance? God does. That's his territory. When we start dabbling in that territory, guess what? We make the same mistake and say that it's other people's fault and not our own fault. I mean, really, in reality, we live in a country where we, the individuals, are the ones who appoint the king. You know, it was the same way in Israel, bringing me to the next bad guy I want to bring up, the next bad guy in the Bible. When we talk about these bad guys in the Bible, Saul, you guys remember Saul? He was super awesome, right? So you go to Samuel, and I love this. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. All the people of Israel, they come out of the book of Judges, and we go through Ruth, and then we go into Samuel. And the people of Israel are like, hey, you know what? We need a king like all the other nations. Now remember what God called them to do? Don't be like who? The other nations. So here they are, all screaming at Samuel. We need a king. We need to be like Europe and how they have socialist programs, right? No. Well, never mind. That was a Freudian slip. He said, we need a king. We need to be exactly like those people over there because look at how well they're doing, right? That's who we need to be like. This judge thing isn't working clearly because it's just violence and violence and violence. No, they didn't care about violence. It was actually what ruled the day. Remember, maximum pleasure, minimum pain. That's how their whole society is working and operating. So now they say, we need a king, we need a king, we need a king. And Samuel goes, you don't want a king because look at, I've raised my own sheep, my own goats. I've not taken anything from any of you. If you have a king like the other countries, he's going to rob you blind. I'm just paraphrasing for time's sake, okay? You can go back to Samuel. It's hilarious. The whole story is funny. The whole story of Samuel. It's one of my favorite books because there's so much comedy inside of it. You just got to be looking for it. So God says, okay, let's give them exactly what they want. And that's one of the scariest things to me is that God would give me exactly what I wanted. Because here, God's like, all right, Samuel, there's going to be this guy who wanders in your tent. He's going to be tall and handsome. He's going to be the new king. So Saul is with his brother, and they're looking for the donkeys that Saul lost because he got drunk, and he ended up passing out in the field, and he lost all his dad's donkeys, right? All of his dad's donkeys went running off, and he can't find the donkeys. So they're wandering around. He doesn't want to go back to dad without the donkeys that he lost. So they're wandering around, and his brother says to him, he says, hey, there's this guy in this town that we're at, and they're having this big meeting, and he's one of those seers. He can see stuff. So we'll go pay him whatever money we have left, and he'll tell us where the donkeys are. So Paul and his brother come staggering into the tent where all the elders of Israel are meeting. They come staggering into the tent, you know, as people do after they've been drinking all night, after losing their dad's donkeys. They come staggering into the tent. They walk up to Samuel, and they're like, here's the money that we need to find dad's donkeys, okay? And if, you know, it would be way better if I could do like a little scene up here. But I'm trying to paint the picture in your mind. He comes staggering in. There's all these elders just disrespecting the entire thing. And then here's Samuel is like, really? You know, really? This is the guy? Okay. So Samuel comes staggering in, and he puts oil on his head. Congratulations, Saul. You are the king of Israel. Okay? So a guy who couldn't keep, there's another word for donkeys. I can't remember what it is, but The guy who lost his donkeys ends up being the king of a bunch of donkeys. So that they can all be, I mean, come on. God has a great sense of humor, doesn't he? Now, ultimately, as Saul is hunting David down, a boy who is chasing after God's heart, and he's trying to murder every political enemy that he's got, and he's made himself the tyrant of the world. David has every right to take his life in that cave, doesn't he? But he takes a piece of his clothing. Who is it that takes out David's enemy? God himself does, doesn't he? Now, another bad guy in the Bible. I'll stick to David because I'm running out of time. Another bad guy in the Bible, Absalom. You guys remember Absalom? He had the pretty hair and, he was pampered. And David had a real problem with his raising kids. Clearly, they all did exactly what they wanted to do. But Absalom, he did some terrible stuff. And then he started hunting his dad, right? He started hunting his dad, just like Saul. Now, by this time, David is not a spring chicken anymore, right? And he's not a spring chicken anymore. And David is just a few men who've stuck by his side. He's sitting in a tent, and he's praying for his son who's hunting him, the bad guy of the story. Who is it who takes Absalom out? Yeah, well, God does. In all reality, in all those stories, each one of those people who became the evil person of the story, they took themselves out. Pharaoh stepped into a place where he shouldn't have. Guess what? God just let go. The Red Sea went back to where it was. That wasn't very smart, was it? How many people go and see an ocean split in two and go, hey, it'd be a good idea to just go step into the middle of this? Does that seem very wise? I don't think so. I mean, unless Moses is in front of me saying, come on, let's go. I'm like, ooh, there's fish swimming there. Come on, there's sharks. This doesn't seem reasonable. All right, well, you got to step out and trust and follow Moses. Well, Pharaoh tried to follow Moses too, but not out of trust, out of hatred and evil. Guess what happened? Well, God doesn't protect hatred and evil, does he? He kind of just lets it go back to where it was, right? The chaos that was Pharaoh is what consumed Pharaoh. I mean, you got to recognize the beauty of that entire story. Pharaoh threw all those babies in the Red Sea. So then he threw into the Nile. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's all right. Large body of water. Either way, Pharaoh threw all those babies into a large body of water, and then guess what he does? Throws himself into a large body of water. How does God deal with our enemies? Does it tell us to pick up the sword of vengeance? Well, there's an interesting story. And I'll end this tyrant idea, this backpack trip we went on through the tyrants of the Bible. I'll end this with this idea. People, as a group, can become tyrants. Did you know that? Well, and last week in studying, and I didn't mention this last week, but it was very powerful to me. I recognized something in myself that I'd like to share with everyone. Last week, as I'm studying the word wrath, right? Because everyone knows what that means. As I'm studying the word wrath, it takes me to a place in the book of John, which is, I know, I don't really have a favorite book, but John is beautifully written. I mean, you guys it's like a painting. It is a painting. In the book of John, Jesus has this interaction with a guy named Nicodemus. And Jesus tells him, you got to be born again. And Nicodemus is like, really? Come on. Okay, that's his response. And then Jesus says this interesting thing about a serpent on a pole. And anyone who doesn't believe, God's wrath is already on him, right? I'm just hitting the high spots. So then I go and I'm like, all right, I've never really studied this serpent on the pole. So I go back and I start looking at the serpent on the pole. And when I do something, I got to read the whole chapter, maybe the chapter before it, and then I end up doing a Bible study for 6 to 10 hours, okay? But I read the chapter, the entire chapter. And the beauty of it, I'm not going to tell you where it's at, but I'm going to give it to you for homework. Okay? You got to go search and find this story in the Bible because Jesus uses a direct reference to it in about how we're supposed to live righteously with one another. This is a direct reference. So, in the story, the people, the Jews, they're in the desert, and then this tribe comes and they get attacked. And a couple people die. There's a battle that ensues, a couple people die. And the people are all angry. They're super mad. And they're like, God, deliver these men into our hands. And God gives them exactly what they want. Delivers them right into their hands. In the very next story, guess what they do? Are they like, okay, God, where are we supposed to go now? I'm so glad you put Moses in charge of us. God gives them exactly what they want. And I'm like, what a bunch of teenagers, okay? Because God gives them exactly what they want. They want vengeance on this tribe that has struck down some of their brothers and sisters. And with vengeance in their heart and vengeance fulfilled, they go and start complaining about how Moses is not the right leader for their tribe. Now they should overthrow him. Right? Does that sound familiar? Does that sound interesting? Well, okay. Some things are starting to line up here. They start complaining about Moses and they start planning a coup. They're going to overthrow him. He's the wrong guy for us. Now, God has just delivered their enemies into their hands through Moses. They've enacted vengeance, wiped the entire tribe out, every man, woman, and child, and God let them do it. Gave them exactly what they wanted. Now, they want to be the ones who are in charge. They want to be the ones who are calling the shots. They want Moses out of the picture. Do you think that makes God happy? No, it doesn't. God brings up these serpents from under the ground, and the serpents start to bite them. And it says, many of them died. And then they pleaded with Moses. Moses, you got to help us. You got to save us, Moses. And Moses is like, hey, there's a bunch of snakes. I don't know where any of this came from. Moses has no idea that these people were plotting to assassinate him. He has no idea. And despite that, he goes and he appeals to God, and God tells him to make a bronze serpent and raise it up. And anyone who looks at the serpent, when the serpent bites them, they're still going to get bitten by the snakes. When the serpent bites them, guess what? It's not going to have any power over them. Right? So, going back to the conversation that Jesus and Nicodemus had, in the Roman time, where Roman occupation is ruling the day, and everyone wants to overthrow these Romans, God deliver our enemies into our hands, just like the Jews who are wandering through the desert, or Israel. Just like them who are wandering through Israel, they want vengeance. They want wrath. They want their enemies to be destroyed. Who does God deliver to them? The Son of Man. And now what's the point? The point is that every one of us, at any given point, we look at authority and we say, look, that can't be right. Look at all the evil things they're doing. But who's the one who owns vengeance? God. And when he enacts vengeance, it's just and righteous. Pharaoh throws himself into the sea. Saul ends up dying by his own blade, the very blade that he refused to use. Every enemy that you think that you have, the very thing that makes them the enemy of God is the thing that will undo them. God's the only one who can love someone completely, even to the end of himself. That's why I maintain this argument that you don't have enemies as a Christian. And the people we pray for are our enemies. The people who think that they're our enemies. Because despite all the evil and terrible things that they want to do or that they are doing, God is the only one who can see the potential of what they could be. And if they're willing for just 1 second to submit to God's authority alone, it could change their entire story. From the tragedy that it is to the reality that it could be. And here we are arguing about the president and Congressman X, Y, and Z. Do you think God knows that they're doing evil things? Do you think God knows those things? Do you think he knows they plot and they do all these terrible things? Well, let me point you back to Psalm 2. Because how do they plot? In vain. Why do the nations rage against the mighty one? The waves can't overtake God. He never did. Because he's the one who called order out of chaos in the first place. He's the one who created the dry land. And he didn't have to destroy or make violence in any of that story. Just like any of the tyrants of the Bible when you see them. All right? You know, one of my favorite ones, you know. I'm drawing a blank on his name. But Daniel's like, you're going to go wander the wilderness like a wild animal if you don't, you know, tone it down a notch. And the guy's like, okay. So that very evening, he's like, he totally forgets about what Daniel said. And he's like, you know what? I am such an awesome guy. All right, let's see how that works out for you, okay? Not too good. So, you just pick a tyrant in the Bible because God overcame them. And how did he overcome them? With their own evil, right? Like, it would be like saying, like, these people that are trying to destroy the church today think that they're so intelligent, and they use these fancy words. And if I was a predictor of the future, not really. I can just look back at the past and say, hey, you know what? Those fancy words and that thing, that violence that you want to enact, guess what? That's what's going to be your ultimate end. Because if we look at history, that's how all the tyrants ended. You know, Joseph Stalin, right? I've read his autobiography. Scary tragedy. Scary evil. Like, people think that Hitler was an evil guy. Joseph Stalin killed his best friends because he thought that they might have a thought that would go against him. Because he looked at himself. Here's the scary thing about looking into a tyrant's mind. The tyrant looks at himself in the mirror and he realizes how untrustworthy he is. And then he projects that on every person who's deemed themselves loyal to him. And then you know what they do? They destroy every person that's protecting them. And then guess what? The ones who don't care about them move in. And then their evil spreads. Because Joseph Stalin, you know what he died from? It wasn't old age. Joseph Stalin got a cold. You know what they did? They locked the door to his room, closed it, and no one went in until he stopped breathing. You know, he died from the common cold. It's a fitting end for someone who sent so many people to die in the cold. Fitting end. God is just. He is righteous. Now think about this. Adolf Hitler. Okay, I'm just going through modern tyrants. And you can make your own assumptions or whatever, because I'm running out of time. Adolf Hitler, one of the people that everyone would say was the worst guy in history. He elevated himself above everyone else. He stood on a podium at the Reichstag and he would make his speeches, you know, the iconic blah, 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 blah. We got to kill everybody who's not us speeches. There's only one right way, you know, and he thought he was the way. And he elevates himself in that Buddhist symbol and everyone else hails him. And then guess where he dies? In a hole, in a bunker by his own hand. In a hole as deep as you can go by his own hand. Is that not a fitting end to someone who's elevated themselves above everyone else? I mean, come on, think about it. God's awesome, isn't he? Because all that blood that was on his hands, well, he paid for it. He's eternally separated from God. The reality is that whether you're willing to submit to authorities, whether you think that they're right or wrong, is irrelevant. Your submission to God is an example that you are practicing what you believe. If the government says, hey, guess what? Because you're a Christian, you've got to pay another 15% in taxes this year. Is it right? Doesn't matter. Because God's testing you and your love. What's more important to you? How much money you have in your pocket or how much love you can show to your neighbor? Because that's the fulfillment of the law. Is that not what Paul just said? Is it what kind of car you drive? Because that's where the metal really hits the meat, doesn't it? In our submission to authority. Because a lot of times, we've been taught our whole lives. We were born that way. Do you think the horse likes it when I pull the bridle? No, it wants to pull the opposite direction. Steering a horse is a lot like steering a car. You make the pain in the direction you want the horse to turn away from, because that's where it goes. What is it that we're letting steer us? Is it pain or is it God? Because love ultimately cost us what? I'll end where I started. Everything. How far are we willing to go for it? Because how far was God willing to go for us? So our love for each other, the way we love a brother, can become the way that God loves all of us. And if we could just show that, just trust in that, then we could fulfill every rule and check off every box without having to check off any boxes. Because following God and living righteously isn't about following a rule. It's about following a person. Do you think Jesus walked around talking about how awesome he was and how well he followed the Torah? Do you think he was so awesome and humble? How many of his own stories did he write? How much of this are you reading from the hand of Jesus himself? None. Because he used his people to do it. Because he used that very vehicle to bring us all in and show us what love really was. So the thing that ultimately we think is going to destroy us is the thing that will help us achieve the potential of the person we can become. So our ability to submit to authority is in direct reference. The genuineness of how we're able to love God. Because if God is the ultimate authority, and he's put a tyrant in charge of me, why would he do that? Because he wants me to see how I'm truly able to love. If he puts a tyrant in charge of me, and the first thing I do is rebel and plot vengeance, who am I trusting? If he puts a tyrant in charge of me, and the first thing I do is try to get a bunch of people together and generate a coup, who have I become? The very evil that I sought to fight in the first place. That's why we see it. You see all these people in the streets yelling peace, equity, justice. And they are the most inequitable, unpeaceful, unjust. You know why? Because they made themselves gods. They denied, chapter 1, Romans, what did they do? They denied the identity that God gave them. And they tried to make their own identity. And in doing so, they started worshiping the natural things. And when they worshiped the natural things, they became the most unnatural thing in all of creation. Men loving men, women loving women. They became the most unnatural things. Because denying that God is the authority of all is the most rebellious act of all. And only humans can do it. The demons that you see, Jesus, you think Jesus is like, all right, if you guys eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, right, you shall enter the kingdom of heaven. And then they all get upset. All these people who are following Jesus, they all get upset, and half of them leave, right? Half of them leave. And then the next story Jesus tells them, he says, we got to cross this lake, and then there's this demon over here, right? There's this guy, he needs our help. And the demon, you think the demon's like, oh, I'm not listening to you. What does that tell you? The only people who can reject God's authority are sitting in this room. That's what we seized when we seized autonomy. And the other thing we seized when we seized that autonomy in the garden was we seized the ability to blame everything but ourselves for the problems we have in our lives. And that's the easiest thing to do. And that's going after the most pleasurable thing and not feeling the pain. Because in reality, most of our lives we've spent running from the very thing that will change us into the person or the people we're meant to be. Because it's painful when we realize how corrupt we really are, how far from God we truly are. And as he chases us through the wilderness and tries to teach us the lessons that we need to learn, at some point, we're going to get exhausted. But let that point be before he does. All right? Amen? So I'll end with a word of prayer. I know it's kind of heavy today, but I think it's good.